Yeah, sure. Hello? Okay, yeah. Looks on. And how does that sound?
I mean, the sound is mostly for the...
Right, the sound is for people watching at home.
Yes.
So.
From your office.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so then after your talk, we'll do Q&A and
Mm-hmm.
because we have to take this microphone, because otherwise people online won't hear anything.
But they can hear me now through this thing.
Yes.
Okay.
It should be.
All right. And, okay. Well, let's see. Do you have any idea how many people normally watch these things? It's...
So for your particular talk, I have about 20 people signed up. That doesn't mean that there aren't more that will tune in because I sent out the URL.
Okay. Oh, sure. I'll be curious as to how much interest there was. Try not to knock that thing off. Okay. Yeah, let's go. Give me a...
Anybody else outside? I'll check. Don't worry. Oh yeah, and in case you wonder, you should kind of stay between those doors, frames.
Oh, because this is where the camera points.
Yes.
So if I wonder, should I do it in a funny walks of the Monty Python style? Or so?
And leave that to you.
Okay. I think that there's a correct answer to that question. So you're just expecting me to know it. You might be assuming too much. Duck and cover. This is not a... anyway.
All right, well, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Sonja Schmid, for those of you who don't know that. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Science and Technology and Society here at Virginia Tech in Northern Virginia. And I'm excited to welcome you to our latest incarnation of the SIREN series. This is the 13th event in this series on nuclear emergency response. SIREN is part of my NSF Career Award on globalizing nuclear emergency response. And in the spirit of this type of grant, we emphasize the importance of both research and education in the area of nuclear emergency preparedness and response. So all SIREN speakers are meeting with graduate students as part of their engagement. And whenever possible, we plan to provide access to a recording of their lectures. SIREN is generously supported by Virginia Tech's Office of the Vice President for the National Capital Region. Many thanks to the staff of the Virginia Tech Research Center's Executive Briefing Center, and especially the IT team for their round-the-clock support. And also thank you to the students, staff, and faculty for helping to make this happen. Before we get started today, I wanted to give you a short preview of the semester. We're still working out the details of the schedule, but we have a very special event confirmed for December 6th. The former chief engineer of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Nikolai Alexandrovich Steinberg, has agreed to come to DC and give a talk in our series. This will be part of a small workshop commemorating an important milestone in nuclear emergency management, the 30th anniversary of completing the concrete entombment of Chernobyl's reactor number 4. Coincidentally, this fall, we're also anticipating the completion of the new safety confinement, the gigantic arch structure that is supposed to enclose the reactor and its original sarcophagus. And we're going to get a report from a group who will be there to witness this event. Edward Geist will actually be part of this.
The theory is that we're scheduled to be there when it moves. I do not think that they would have scheduled the activities we're doing there if they didn't think the schedule was going to slip. So. Yep. I hope to be there when it happens, but I'm not counting on it.
Well, so stay tuned. We'll keep you posted. This talk today will be live streamed, and we have numerous remote participants signed up who are joining us not only from the main campus in Blacksburg, from other US universities, federal agencies, and national labs, but also from institutions abroad. So welcome to our remote participants. If you're watching us online and would like to submit a question to our speaker or a comment, please send an email indicating your name and affiliation to SIREN, S-I-R-E-N, at vt.edu, as in virginiatech.edu. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So, Dr. Edward Geist is an associate policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Previously a MacArthur Nuclear Security Fellow at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, CSAC, he received his PhD in Soviet history from the University of North Carolina in May 2013. His research interests include emergency management in nuclear disasters, Soviet politics and culture, and the history of nuclear power and weapons. Edward is also interested in the potential uses of simulation and modeling for historians, and is developing a piece using these techniques to explore the potential historical implications of the US and Soviet Union's use of qualitatively different technical assumptions to model strategic nuclear exchanges. A recipient of fellowships from Fulbright Hays and American councils to conduct research in Moscow and Kiev, he has published articles in the Journal of Cold War Studies on bomb shelters in the Soviet Union, the Slavic Review on the failure of emergency management at Chernobyl, the Russian Review on, believe it or not, a Soviet cookbook, and the Bulletin of the History of Medicine on tainted ice cream in the early 20th century United States. His RAND publications include briefings on advanced reactor technologies and on technological lessons from Fukushima. Finally, he also manages to blog about the unthinkable at sovietologist.blogspot.com and is a frequent traveler to Chernobyl nuclear power plant and adjacent territories. In his forthcoming monograph, which this talk is based on, he compares Soviet and US civil defense during the Cold War, drawing upon previously unexamined archival sources to examine the similarities and differences in how the two superpowers faced the dilemmas of the nuclear age. How did they envision an insurance against Armageddon? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Edward Geist.
Thank you. So just for propriety's sake, I should emphasize that all of this work was done before I started at RAND and should not be considered as having any kind of association with the RAND Corporation. Although I don't think anything I say is going to be too... Okay. So Bert, as it turns out, is more than a little atypical. For many contemporary Americans, however, he's come to be considered the embodiment not just of civil defense, but of an entire era. And I certainly know where they're coming from because when I first began studying this subject, that was my view as well. After all, I'd seen The Atomic Cafe, and like a lot of people, I assumed that duck and cover was the quintessence of what Cold War civil defense was all about. Cynical buffoonery perpetrated upon a conformist populace in order to convince them that all one needed to survive nuclear war were some practiced reflexes and an ordinary school desk. I came to realize that I was very wrong about this. Not only is duck and cover not a characteristic artifact of civil defense, it's not even all that typical of American civil defense in the 50s. In fact, the very things that make it so compelling are also why it's so unusual. Let me tell you a story about duck and cover that you probably haven't heard before. So, Duck and Cover premiered in January 1952, but within less than a year, the Federal Civil Defense Administration concluded that the entire media campaign, of which it had been just one small part, had been a mistake. Dwight Eisenhower's choice to head the FCDA, former Nebraska Governor Val Peterson, even mocked Duck and Cover in an April 1954 radio interview, in which he explained that let nobody get the idea that a policy of duck and cover is our only answer to the H-bomb. That would be plain ridiculous. In light of the understanding of thermonuclear weapons, the next year the FCDA went one step further by attempting to recall all copies of some early civil defense films, including Duck and Cover, presumably so that they might be destroyed. So obviously the FCDA failed in its attempt to condemn our friend Bert to the Orwellian memory hole. But the fact that it tried to do so illustrates the extent to which duck and cover diverged from their evolving conception of how to address the challenge of nuclear war. To understand the role played by civil defense in the Cold War, we must look elsewhere. So what was Cold War civil defense? Firstly, Cold War civil defense was a tragedy because in a sane world it wouldn't have been needed. But today a scholarly consensus has emerged that we came disturbingly close to a nuclear exchange at multiple points during the course of the Cold War. Secondly, Cold War civil defense was a failure in that neither US nor Soviet civil defense ever felt like they were achieving their institutional goals, despite the fact that Soviet civil defense spending was much higher than that of the United States. Far from having a blasé confidence that they were ready to face the scourge of nuclear war, in private they pressed political leaders time and again for the immense resources that would be needed to protect civilian populations, only to be rebuffed. But civil defense was not a lie. In the course of my research, I determined that both US and Soviet civil defense officials strove to create civil defense programs that could plausibly work. And they did this for two reasons. First, they genuinely believed in the possibility of enemy attack. If anything, the views of the enemy that they expressed in private were even more dire than the statements in civil defense propaganda indicated. And the second and more prosaic reason was that any plausible civil defense program would necessarily be extraordinarily expensive. The immense resources needed to prepare to survive nuclear war stood to greatly increase the wealth and influence of the civil defense organizations. So for precisely these reasons, while civil defense propaganda sometimes stoked fear of nuclear war or dread of the enemy on purpose, often with the goal of fomenting popular and political support for civil defense, it was not cynical as has often been asserted. And finally, politics, rather than technical or strategic concerns, made or broke civil defense. In the United States, congressional opposition always stymied the goals of civil defense, but this opposition seems to have stemmed more from fiscal conservatism than from a conviction that civil defense would either be technically infeasible or strategically destabilizing. In the Soviet Union, a fortuitous institutional alliance between the increasingly influential Soviet military and civil defense allowed its program to enjoy much greater success than its US counterpart. So several of my conclusions differ from those of the existing historiography of US civil defense. And the reason for that is my use of previously unexamined sources. So mine is the first study of Soviet civil defense using archival materials, which include both local, Republic, and Union level documents from archives in Russia and Ukraine. And in the United States, I tapped sources from federal civil defense agencies that are held in national archives and still lack finding aids. So due to personnel shortages, only a small fraction of the records of US civil defense have actually been examined and sorted by the archivist. But with a bit of pestering, I got the archivist to give me a bunch of boxes that had not been opened in over 30 years. And what those boxes contained necessitated a reassessment of US civil defense. So how did civil defense define itself? So civil defense is the use of measures such as shelter and evacuation to reduce damage to life and property caused by enemy attack or other disaster. So in the definition of civil defense in both of the superpowers evolved as the Cold War progressed, and that owed only in part to the increasing number and yield of nuclear weapons. So note what isn't in these definitions: continuity of government functions and emergency management in peacetime disasters. So institutionally, the relationship of civil defense to continuity of government planning varied over time in both of the superpowers. And at first, civil defense concerned itself only with the consequences of enemy air attack, and it lacked any institutional mandate to prepare for natural or technological calamities. Over time, however, civil defense devoted more and more attention to these emergencies, and by 1991, both American and Soviet civil defense had expanded their purview to preparations to survive and mitigate the effects not only of nuclear war, but also of industrial accidents, extreme weather events, and natural disasters such as earthquakes. As a result, civil defense came to be known by different names, as emergency management in English and гражданская защита, or civil protection in Russian. But in both of the superpowers, civil defense was more than a concept. It was an institution. And these institutions strove to act in what they considered their own self-interest. Rather than the result of impersonal historical forces or the passive instrument of senior political leaders, US and Soviet civil defense both conceived of themselves as organizations charged with the awesome responsibility of assuring the survival of their respective civilizations. Cognizant of the threat posed by nuclear weapons, American and Soviet civil defense officials recognized that any serious attempt to protect citizens would require enormous expenditures. and compelled both by their genuine belief in the possibility of enemy attack and the resources and prestige that their organizations might accrue fortifying their societies to survive nuclear war, they waged battles behind the scenes of Cold War politics to make their ambitious programs a reality. And both the institutional characteristics of U.S. and Soviet civil defense and the personalities of the individuals that led them in their relative success or lack thereof. So, of course, to understand civil defense, we need to go back to the immediate post-war period. So the United States had employed nuclear weapons against Japan with only a vague understanding of what effects they might have. And after the conclusion of hostilities, both the United States and the Soviet Union took an intense interest in the consequences of the atomic bombings. So curiously, Soviet observers actually reached Hiroshima and Nagasaki first. 2 agents who were dispatched from the Soviet embassy in Tokyo reached Hiroshima on August the 16th. That's 10 days after the bombing. But of course, the ability of the Soviets to examine the effects of the bombing was limited by the start of the U.S. occupation. So a few weeks after that, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey entered Japan and began its studies. As the USSBS found in its study of the effects of the atomic bombs on Japan, those residents who were lucky enough to be in shelters at the time of the explosions fared remarkably well. So in Nagasaki, 400 people who took cover in hillside tunnel shelters like those seen in this photograph survived despite their location close to ground zero. As the USSBS report noted, the shelters consisted of rough tunnels dug horizontally into the sides of hills with crude earth-filled blast walls protecting the entrances. The blast walls were blown in, but all the occupants back from the entrances survived, even in those tunnels almost directly under the explosion. Those not in direct line with the entrance were uninjured. These results led the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist to declare in August 1946 that, without question, shelters can protect those who get to them against anything but a direct hit. Despite this sanguine attitude about the feasibility of civil defense, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union embarked upon implementing a civil defense against nuclear attack in the immediate post-war years. In the era of the U.S. atomic monopoly, many Americans hoped that the Soviets would lack the bomb for the immediate future, with the result that civil defense could simply wait. Some in the military and Truman administration saw differently, however, and a number of studies of how a civil defense would be constituted were undertaken both inside and outside the Pentagon during the late 1940s. So the most central figure in these efforts was the man pictured here on the left, Colonel Barnett Beers. Beers was commander of the Civil Defense Team of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and personally surveyed bomb damage in Europe and Japan, including in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Beers' observations convinced him that civil defense against nuclear weapons was both feasible and necessary. But the Truman administration repeatedly delayed the establishment of a civil defense agency until after the outbreak of war in Korea in 1950. Stung by criticism of earlier proposals that had made civil defense a military responsibility and would have granted primary authority to it for it to the federal rather than state and local governments, the resulting Civil Defense Act of 1950 created the Federal Civil Defense Administration within the Executive Office of the President and devolved much responsibility for civil defense planning to the states. So in the USSR, meanwhile, nuclear warfare remained an ideologically fraught topic due to the attitude of Joseph Stalin, who publicly dismissed the bomb as something that could only frighten a weak-nerved people. Ordinary Soviet citizens received almost no information about the new weapons, other than that they existed, that the United States had used them in Japan, and that the Soviet government had condemned them as barbaric and demanded that they be banned. While a few Soviet citizens who were connected with the Soviet atomic project and apprised of nuclear developments in the West, however, reacted with alarm to this lack of civil defense in the Soviet Union and suggested that the USSR needed to begin developing a civil defense. So one of these figures was Boris Vannikov, the man pictured here on the right. So Vannikov was the head of the First Main Directorate, which was the ambiguously named organization set up to build nuclear weapons for Stalin. And Vannikov drafted a letter for the dictator in late 1947, arguing that the USSR needed to adapt its civil defense to respond to an American atomic attack. However, the procedures of the Special Committee under the Council of Ministers, I'm sorry to be tormenting you with all of these meaningless sounding Soviet names, which was the organization that ran the Soviet atomic effort under the watchful eye of Lavrentiy Beria, caused the letter to be edited considerably before it was sent to Stalin. So seemingly due to the belief that Stalin would take offense at measures that implicitly and explicitly denied that the bomb wasn't a real threat to Soviet security, The ultimate version of the letter just completely removed Vannikov's civil defense proposal. The Soviet government would only begin building a civil defense against atomic attack in 1953, after Stalin's death. So after the establishment of the FCDA, its officials believed that congressional appropriations would soon be forthcoming to build a multi-billion-dollar system of public blast shelters. Congress, however, allocated only $32 million to the FCDA of the $403 million it had requested. The FCDA attributed this political setback to a lack of popular appreciation of the imminence of the Soviet nuclear threat, and responded by declaring war on apathy. As Assistant Administrator James J. Wadsworth, the man who actually ran the FCDA in this period, put it, the people of this country are not aware generally of the dangers of enemy attack. They are not aware that they desperately need to know how to save their own skins. Hence the origin of duck and cover, our cities must fight, and the other civil defense propaganda of the Truman years. These were, in fact, an attempt by the tail to wag the dog. They were intended not to convince the public that nuclear war was acceptable, as latter-day critics often charged, but rather to stoke public fear of nuclear war and the belief that this would translate into political support for the FCDA's expensive schemes to shelter American urbanites from nuclear attack. This effort failed, much to the FCDA's consternation, and after the election of Dwight Eisenhower, the new administration insisted upon adopting a policy of tactical evacuation as a more cost-effective alternative to shelters. Meanwhile, following Stalin's death in March 1953 and the subsequent execution of Lavrentiy Beria, the post-Stalin leadership decided that the earlier decision to forestall civil defense planning for nuclear war had been a serious error. In September 1953, they ordered the USSR Civil Defense Organization, known in Russian as Местная противовоздушная оборона, or MPVO, which literally translates as Local Anti-Air Defense, to begin developing guidelines to shape a civil defense program against nuclear attack. So the resulting document, which was finalized in July of 1954, established assumptions that would underlie Soviet civil defense planning for the remainder of the Cold War. So most importantly, it envisioned a surge program that would rely upon strategic warning to provide time to bring existing shelters to readiness, build some expedient shelters, and carry out evacuations. So this presumed a warning time of several days to a week. And given the unformed state of Soviet nuclear strategy when the guidelines were composed, it seems that this assumption was not something that came out of Soviet nuclear strategy and was given to the civil defense people. This is something that the civil defense people assumed because of the prohibitively high cost of building enough shelters for all targeted populations. And furthermore, the civil defense plans of the mid-50s only planned for the effects of nominal fission weapons like those dropped on Japan, without any consideration of the fallout hazards that had actually been observed in the Soviets' own nuclear tests in Kazakhstan. So this new civil defense program only became publicly apparent in late 1955, when the Soviet government launched a new mass training campaign that was only the first of several intended to teach Soviet citizens how to survive nuclear war. Ranging from 10 hours to 22 hours of instruction, the training campaigns were largely developed and carried out not by the MPVO itself, but rather by the Voluntary Society for Assistance to Aviation, Army, and the Navy, known in Russian by the acronym DOSAAF. DOSAAF's institutional interests diverged from those of the MPVO, and it only did an indifferent job of implementing these civil defense training campaigns. So simultaneously, the USSR embarked on an ambitious program of shelter building. But this program only sought to build shelters for a fraction of urban dwellers, and only the number of shelters that were available failed to reach even those targets. So, for instance, as of January 1959, Podolsk, which is a small city south of Moscow, planned that even after evacuation, 73,000 of the city's 140,000 residents would remain and require shelter. The city possessed shelters with space for only about 17,000 people, with additional basements the MPVO estimated as sufficient for 5,700 people. So the emergence of the colossal fallout threat associated with thermonuclear weapons after the March 1954 Castle Bravo test in the Pacific, which is pictured on the left here, caught civil defense planners off guard. So at first, the Atomic Energy Commission did not even tell the Federal Civil Defense Administration about the disastrous radiological consequences of the test. And after it did, the security restrictions limited the number of FCDA personnel made privy to it to just a select handful of officials. Those conditions led to a phenomenon that civil defense planners dubbed the "oh my God" phase. Furthermore, FCDA officials were among the first in Washington to anticipate that the Soviet ICBM threat would materialize sooner rather than later. So the picture on the right is the world's first ICBM, the Soviet R-7 Semyorka. So this new reality compelled the FCDA to redefine the goals of civil defense, where in the early 1950s, FCDA officials had envisioned a nuclear war that would be fought with a relatively limited number of nominal fission weapons that would be delivered by subsonic manned bombers that could be shot down, with the result that the nuclear war they were planning for would be both survivable and winnable. Now the objective was just marginal improvements in survivability. And even those would require many more resources than the shelter plans pursued under Truman. So rather than give up on the country, the FCDA turned the fallout problem into an argument for more aggressive civil defense policy. Emboldened by congressional proponents of civil defense such as Estes Gefoiver and Chet Holofield, FCDA officials dared to propose eye-wateringly expensive public shelter proposals to Eisenhower, starting with a $14 billion program and then escalating to a $32 billion proposal. So those are 1950s dollars, and for reference, the original Interstate Highway Act, which was passed in 1956, was envisioned to cost only $25 billion at the time. So the fiscally conservative Eisenhower, having obviously lost control of the FCDA, elected to remove the troublesome Peterson by making him ambassador to Denmark and merging the FCDA itself with another agency to create the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization, which had greater responsibilities than the FCDA had, but a smaller budget. In 1958, the OCDM stated unequivocally that there will be no federally funded shelter program. Instead, it promoted a dubious policy of encouraging Americans to build home fallout shelters that left both advocates and critics of civil defense unimpressed. Similarly, by the end of the 1950s, Soviet leaders came to reject costly civil defense programs. The increasing influence of confirmed civil defense skeptic Anastas Mikoyan, who is seen here enjoying a hot dog during his 1959 visit to the United States, along with hope that Khrushchev's policy of peaceful coexistence would become a reality, convinced the Soviet Communist Party's presidium to cancel the entire civil defense program in December 1959. Shelter building ceased, and most civil defense employees were fired. The MPVO general staff, however, were transferred to the Soviet Ministry of Defense. So, taking an unusual initiative to save themselves from oblivion, the MPVO general staff seized upon the strategic theories of Erich Hampe, a West German civil defense expert, to justify why the USSR needed an all-encompassing civil defense that went far beyond the comparatively delineated activities of local anti-air defense. In reflection of this, in mid-1960, they renamed themselves the Civil Defense General Staff. They also benefited from the swift downturn in superpower relations in 1960 to 61 between the U-2 crisis and the Berlin crisis, and which came to convince the CPSU Presidium to revive civil defense on a new basis in July 1961. And while this new organization began modernizing the technical basis for the program and developing schemes to protect the USSR's population from fallout, as well as improving civil defense education campaigns, the shelter building was not resumed for several years. And due to its lack of personnel and resources, Soviet civil defense was almost totally impotent at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So around the same time the USSR revived its civil defense effort, the United States also took steps to revitalize its civil defense program. So President Kennedy was a long-standing civil defense advocate. I actually found letters in the archive that he had sent to President Truman in the late 40s when he was the junior congressman from Massachusetts, demanding that Truman speed up the civil defense program. And in the same May 25th, 1961 speech, in which he proposed to send a man to the moon before this decade is out, Kennedy also declared his intention to reestablish civil defense on a new basis. Insisting that civil defense had no deterrent value, he argued that it instead constituted a form of insurance, that America would never forgive itself for foregoing in the event of catastrophe. To administrate the new program, Kennedy abolished the OCDM and established the Office of Civil Defense within the Department of Defense. Unfortunately, the Kennedy administration committed several publicity missteps that attracted considerable negative attention to civil defense, particularly a re-endorsement of the earlier home fallout shelter campaign as a stopgap measure. And public statements, including overly optimistic assessments of the effectiveness of such shelters, helped stoke a firestorm of criticism that saw much of the mainstream press turn on civil defense in a way that wasn't seen during the 1950s. The program ultimately pursued by the Kennedy administration sought to save as many Americans as possible without investing in costly public blast shelters. So the solution to this challenge came in the form of community fallout shelters located in existing buildings. The plans called for identifying and stocking shelters for 220 million people for a projected 1970 population of just 180 million people. reaching that number would require not just all usable fallout shelter space in existing buildings, but also incentives to encourage the development of new fallout shelter space. And the 40 million space overkill would account for diurnal population shifts, as well as make the system less sensitive to the manner in which the Soviets targeted their weapons. So this chart, which is based on 1964 Department of Defense studies, shows how Kennedy's community shelter program only sought a marginal. Even under optimistic assumptions, the Department of Defense never expected the fallout shelter program to reduce total fatalities under 40 million. The populations in immediate target areas, that is the gray areas on the lower part of the chart, were simply written off. And even so, the DoD studies comparing the community shelter system to other damage-limiting options to try and reduce American losses in a nuclear war, such as the Nike X ABM system or acquiring additional offensive forces, found that civil defense was a far more cost-effective alternative. But the fallout shelter program found its influential congressional civil defense opponents, such as Albert Thomas of Texas, continued to oppose shelters for the same vague sort of fiscal reasons as in the 1950s. Increasingly, civil defense was under attack from both the technical community and the increasingly influential arms control community. And while Pittman's efforts to manage to overcome opposition in the House of Representatives, where the shelter incentive program passed by a 2/3 majority, the companion bill died in committee in the Senate in early 1964. Pittman blamed President Johnson and Robert McNamara for failing to intervene on behalf of the program and resigned in disgust. And while large numbers of the community shelters were marked, the lack of funding meant that only a fraction of them were ever stocked. And when those supplies passed their expiration date, they were not replaced. So as a result, the civil defense program entered a decline in the late 60s from which it never really emerged. So I put some numbers on that. So by 1966, the shelter signs had been posted on 93,110 facilities with 81,488,000 shelter spaces. But only supplies had only been purchased for 63 million spaces, and only 38 million spaces had actually been stocked due to the lack of storage space in the shelters. So at this point, the trajectories of US and Soviet civil defense diverged markedly. So the leaders of the Soviet Union, who greatly feared the prospect of a nuclear attack from the United States, devoted increasing resources to the civil defense program and eventually began constructing large numbers of blast shelters designed to withstand not just fallout, but also the blast, radiation, and fire effects of nuclear weapons. And increasingly stringent technical standards for shelters meant that most of the shelters that had been built in earlier decades were now obsolete. So note in these figures that the total number of shelters in Soviet Ukraine actually went down during the 1960s. And even though Soviet civil defense plans envisioned evacuating most of the population to the countryside and then housing them in expedient fallout shelters, with the blast shelters only sufficient for the largest shift of workers at facilities designated essential, the number of shelters required still strained the budget. And the means developed by Soviet civil defense to increase available shelter space included developing mines into strange Lovian bomb shelters, creating a literal mine shaft gap between the superpowers. In 1970, the Politburo elected to sharply increase the rate of shelter construction with the goal of building enough shelters to meet the requirements of its surge program. In the mid-1970s, the USSR was completing blast shelters with 1 million spaces every year and fallout shelters with several million additional spaces. So while there were only ever enough of these shelters for a few percent of the Soviet population, in the 1970s and 1980s they reached a pinnacle of technical sophistication arguably unmatched anywhere else in the world. Often large enough to shelter thousands of occupants. These shelters incorporated features intended to protect against not just the blast and radiation effects of nuclear weapons, but fires as well. Western technical experts were extremely impressed by Soviet shelter designs, and as I've personally been inside of some of these shelters, I can attest that they are not just propaganda. And along with the shelter campaign, Soviet civil defense also continued and expanded its education campaigns. Because of censorship, the USSR lacked film and fiction portrayals of the post-nuclear environment, so civil defense training constituted the primary way in which Soviet citizens learned about nuclear war. The depiction of nuclear war in Soviet civil defense propaganda was far from sanguine. The images are often, for lack of a better term, creepy. To put it mildly, there are no cartoon turtles in Soviet civil defense propaganda. And while in theory all Soviet citizens are supposed to be exposed to mandatory civil defense training, both in school and in the workplace, civil defense does not appear to have enjoyed, much more public confidence in the USSR than it did in the United States. Local officials and factory managers who were charged with carrying out various civil defense tasks often skimped on them if they felt they could get away with it. And individual citizens rarely seem to have taken enthusiastically to civil defense training. Popular skepticism likely resulted, at least in part, from the fact that Soviet civil defense was actually pretty forthright about the effects of nuclear weapons and treated citizens to images of death and injury and a smoldering radioactive vision of a recognizable Soviet environment. And all of their investment in civil defense didn't convince Soviet leaders that they could risk a nuclear war with impunity. Terrified of the prospect of an American attack and unwilling for ideological reasons to contemplate the destruction of the Soviet state, they instead saw the program as a kind of hedge that might allow some kind of mutilated rump state to be reconstituted out of the ruins following a nuclear exchange. Civil defense officials themselves fretted extensively about the weaknesses in their program, particularly its need for a substantial warning period for effectiveness. In 1974, the Soviet civil defense head, Colonel General Alexander Altunin, who's pictured here on the left, published an article arguing that the USSR needed shelters for the entire urban population in order to meet the threat of a surprise attack from the US. So, some in the US, however, who were alarmed by the Soviet civil defense buildup and concerned that the Kremlin might employ civil defense as an instrument of strategic coercion. They argued that the existence of the program showed that the USSR's leaders considered nuclear war winnable, that the Kremlin was pursuing a dangerous war survival strategy, and that the US needed to adjust its own nuclear strategy and civil defense in order to compensate. So Soviet civil defense officials, who turn out to have monitored Western publications about civil defense quite closely, responded to these accusations with a mixture of incredulity and horror. Altunin himself responded to such charges with a rejoinder that his program threatens nobody and that it does not and cannot upset the strategic balance. The Carter administration, however, came to disagree with Altunin. So U.S. officials attempted to get civil defense on the agenda for future arms control talks with the Soviets, only to be rebuffed. And that strengthened the hand of hawks in the U.S. who felt that the U.S. needed to have a civil defense program like that of the USSR. They were impressed by computer models that suggested that a strategic evacuation program could protect a very large fraction of Americans at moderate cost, and they were further influenced by the fact that the USSR civil defense plans required strategic warning in order to work. So administration officials decided in 1978 to pursue a program that was substantially modeled after that of the USSR. Dubbed Crisis Relocation Planning, or CRP, the new civil defense was to combine strategic evacuations with community shelters like those pursued in the Kennedy years. In late 1978, Carter signed Presidential Directive 41, which declared that the new civil defense would contribute to America's strategic posture. Like earlier U.S. civil defense programs, however, the CRP quickly foundered in the face of congressional skepticism. Without the funding to launch implementation of the program, the Defense Civil Preparedness Agency, and after 1979, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, made only limited progress towards implementing CRP. In 1982, the Reagan administration made a renewed push to implement CRP, only to attract a firestorm of criticism due to the overall weaknesses of the concept and some astonishing gaffes from administration officials that suggested that this administration really was glib about the threat of nuclear war. Opponents of Reagan's defense policies latched onto CRP as an irresistible target to ridicule the administration. Again denied funding by Congress, by the mid-1980s, FEMA refocused its energies on continuity of government functions, even though CRP nominally remained official policy. So, unfortunately, the crisis at 3 Mile Island transpired during the process of merging federal emergency management responsibilities into the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The crisis began in the early hours of March 28th of 1979, when a still ambiguous combination of equipment failure and operator error caused a loss of coolant accident at the plant's second reactor. Then it only became apparent in the mid-1980s that about half of the reactor's fuel melted in the first hours of the accident. And it's probably a good thing that nobody realized that at the time, because federal and state authorities would have ordered an evacuation, a general evacuation had they known, that could only have resulted in total chaos. As it happened, on March the 30th of 1979, the plant operators decided to release radioactive gas via the ventilation stack as part of their efforts to try and control the situation inside the reactor. And unfortunately, the message that they sent to the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency gave the erroneous impression that the release was uncontrolled. And so Pima asked the NRC whether they should order a general evacuation, and the NRC said yes. But authority for the evacuation actually lay with Pennsylvania Governor Richard Thornburg. Am I pronouncing that right? Do you know? Okay. And the Defense Civil Preparedness Agency had told Thornburg that the existing evacuation plans were totally unusable. So instead, he announced a voluntary evacuation of pregnant women and children living within a 5-mile radius of the plant. So a much larger number of Pennsylvanians actually left the area around 3 Mile Island during the crisis. And Pima set up these evacuation centers, the example of which is in the photograph on the lower right, to receive them, even though it turns out that most of the people who evacuated or self-evacuated during the crisis found alternatives to these evacuation centers. So in contrast to 3 Mile Island, which was something of a wet firecracker, Chernobyl really gave civil defense a real workout. And huge amounts of ink have been spilled about the causes of the explosion that destroyed Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on April 26, 1986. But as far as radiological emergency management is concerned, this debate kind of misses the point. Because while the explosion ejected a fraction of the reactor core into the surrounding area, most of the radiological release, particularly the volatile radioisotopes that spread considerable distances, seems to have occurred days later as the plant's fuel heated up and melted down. And much of that material ended up being deposited hundreds of kilometers from the plant. So as you can see from the map here on the left, evacuated areas include not just the areas of Ukraine and Belarus that are adjacent to Chernobyl, but also areas up in Western Russia. And note furthermore that those areas that are up in Western Russia are considerably far away from the plant than Kiev is. And in the early May of 1986, the Soviet leadership was absolutely panicked because they were afraid that the weather was going to change and redirect that sort of contamination back toward Kiev, perhaps necessitating that it be evacuated. So it's sometimes asserted that the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster proved that the USSR's supposed civil defense prowess was just a myth. And so I made 4 research trips to Ukraine to ascertain what role Soviet civil defense played at Chernobyl, and which resulted in the publication of the first archivally based assessment of the emergency management in the disaster last year. And it turns out that the immediate aftermath of the explosion, that in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, civil defense officials were about the only people on the scene who had defensible priorities in retrospect, because they started arguing very quickly for prompt evacuations over the objection of party and military leaders. For instance, the plant civil defense director, a man named Serafim Vorobyov, was the first individual who attempted to report the seriousness of the accident to the central government, only to be silenced by the plant administrator. General Altunin, second in command, who is General Boris Ivanov, who is pictured here on the right, arrived in the area less than a day after the explosion and ended up circumventing formal procedure to order evacuations of the area around the plant on his own initiative over the objections of other military officials. And I argue that the KGB and party intentionally obscured the role of civil defense in the accident in retrospect in order to protect their own legitimacy. Because the obvious official incompetence on display at Chernobyl looks even worse. But that the party and KGB decided that they could just wait and see. So while the Communist Party leadership later found it convenient to scapegoat civil defense in general, and Altunin in particular for their supposed incompetence, the Soviet civil defense had important contributions to the post-accident liquidation effort. Civil defense had primary responsibility for decontaminating the power plant building at Chernobyl, as the power plant was actually restored and put back into service, or the 3 remaining reactors of it were, by the next year. And civil defense set up a system for monitoring the radiological contamination of food. Chernobyl also served as an important impetus for the evolution of Soviet civil defense into a modern emergency management agency. Reorienting themselves towards peacetime disasters, Chernobyl veterans helped organize and cultivate post-Soviet Russia's Ministry of Extraordinary Situations, a professionalized emergency management agency whose record of competence and popularity with the Russian public would be the envy of FEMA. So what does all this mean? I estimate that the USSR spent much more than the United States on civil defense, both in relative and absolute terms, to the extent that Soviet rubles can really be equated with dollars. So in its heydays in the 1950s and 1970s, Soviet civil defense spending seems to have been on the order of about 1% of overall Soviet defense spending. And that may not sound like much, but US civil defense spending was usually more like 0.1%. And even in its single best year, which was fiscal year 1962, it was only 1/3% of overall US defense spending. But Soviet leaders were anything but confident that they'd get much of a return out of their investment in civil defense. And furthermore, the Soviet civil defense officials never regarded their system as operationally mature. Both US and Soviet civil defense attempted to act in their own self-interest, and in practice that meant pushing for the blast shelters that appeared essential to protect their populations against atomic attack. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, civil defense leaders, appointed with the expectation that they would keep civil defense costs manageable, ended up advocating for massively increased shelter spending. So, like Val Peterson a decade before, Marshal Vasily Chuikov, who ran Soviet civil defense in the 1960s, began his tenure with a declaration of a new policy emphasizing inexpensive seeming evacuation measures, only to be pushing for unprecedented shelter building programs by his departure. The difference was that some of Chuikov's shelters actually got built. And that was because Soviet civil defense managed to forge a much more fortuitous set of institutional alliances than its US counterpart. To navigate American politics, civil defense needed many friends in many places. In the USSR, all that was needed was the military and a few choice men in the Kremlin. Finally, all of the hand-wringing in the United States during the Cold War over the supposed strategic importance of civil defense just isn't borne out by the historical record. The US rejection of civil defense didn't have the effect of convincing the Soviet Union of the benign nature of American intentions. Nor did many Americans correctly identify Soviet civil defense for what it really was. Not a war survival strategy, but rather a declaration in steel and concrete of just how afraid they were of us. Oh, thank you.
Okay, time for questions, comments. And please introduce yourself.
Didn't FEMA move away, or I guess U.S. policy move away from, Dr. Jeff Glick, adjunct professor here at Virginia Tech and work at DHS. Used to work at FEMA in the program you were talking about back in the day. But anyway, didn't FEMA move away from encouraging sheltering and move to sort of population relocation and as their sort of cheap alternative solution? Did you research that? Was there any equivalent to that in Russia?
Yeah, so the Russian, they had made a distinction between what they called рассредоточнение, which means evacuation and dispersal, which unfortunately is like dispersal means something different in English, so it's very confusing to try and translate these terms. But yeah, so basically the Soviets were already thinking along the lines of what I've seen in FEMA documents from the 80s, that they were doing the thing that FEMA wanted to do, is that FEMA wanted to have some shelters to protect certain populations, but there was just clearly no political support whatsoever for these things at that point. So, but the bulk of the Soviet population was supposed to depend on these population movement schemes. So the idea was like, okay, we'll know a week in advance there's going to be a nuclear war. And so the women and the children and like senior citizens, people who aren't needed to work in critical industries, they'll be relocated potentially far away. And then the families of the critical workers will be relocated to these fancier fallout shelters that we're building on the outskirts of the urban areas. And then the workers will be able to use these fancy blast shelters at these critical plants if they're at the plant at the time, and then they will be moved back and forth to the dispersal areas, what the Russian term roughly translates as, where their families are. And all of this was organized because they realized that, oh, well, if we take these people's families and we move them far away, they won't stay and keep the economy going until the nuclear war happens. So the idea was to keep industry going until the last possible moment before the nuclear war, because they don't know how long the crisis will last. Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
John Medeiros, recent student at Virginia Tech University. When I look at the threats, I look at heat, I look at blast, and I look at radiation as the three primary threats.
Right.
When you compare the U.S. versus the Soviet Union strategies on defense against or civil defense, did they differ in how they looked at those three threats in terms of the type of civil defense they provide? Thank you.
It's kind of unfair to compare the Soviet program that reached a much higher level of maturity to its funding-starved American counterpart, right? So basically, the Soviets are actually, and still the Russians now, have programs that are heir to these colder era civil defense programs, and they have like a network of research institutes that focuses on this sort of question. And because of that, and because they also followed, and presumably still do follow, Western literature, is like basically they know all we know. They also know this other stuff that they learned in some cases from their horrible nuclear accidents and their nuclear weapons production complex. And so you could argue that they basically just know more than we do. On a related note, an area of my research that I was doing at Stanford is that US and Soviet nuclear weapons effects models are not the same. And there are a number of reasons for that. But in some ways, it's mostly not so immediately relevant for civil defense, at least the things that I've seen. Some of it seems like it should matter for military targeting. It's not really a fair comparison. Then the US is like, we focus on the fallout shelters, but that's a political decision because that's what they can get the money for. Whereas I've seen all of these documents from inside of these civil defense organizations where they want to do blast shelters. And they come up with, the US civil defense people come up with all these notions of how it's like, okay, well, how cheap can we build a blast shelter if the politics change? Like, we want to sort of have the groundwork to have a blast shelter program whenever it becomes possible. But the actual program that is being put forward and implemented, such as they're able to, just focuses on fallout because it's cheap. And that's not because it's like they don't think fire is a problem and they don't think blast is a problem. It's not like they think that fallout is the only problem. They think that fallout is the only thing that they can save people for on a shoestring.
I wanted to encourage our online participants also to submit questions. The email that you can send your questions or comments to is siren@vt.edu. That's SIREN @vt.edu. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, other questions?
Hi, I'm Rich Tantadinato, currently a Virginia Tech grad student. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've run across in recent work with emergency response is the whole idea of an all hazards approach.
Right.
How do the Russians approach that? I mean, is this same operation also responsible for things like fires and floods and earthquakes, or do they have something else?
Yeah, so it turns out that it is, it's complicated because I found documents where Soviet civil defense organizations on a local or republic level were getting involved in this peacetime emergency management stuff. So there would be like mudslide. There was like an earthquake in Armenia in the 40s that apparently civil defense people were involved in. There is mudslides in Kazakhstan in the 50s and 60s, and apparently civil defense went in and started on their own initiative. The Kazakh civil defense organization started getting involved in peacetime hazards. They actually had no institutional mandate to do that stuff at all. It was technically the responsibility of other organizations. And in the 1970s, one of Altunen's sort of entrepreneurial efforts was that he tried to get civil defense involved formally in these sorts of events. And that ultimately led to the evolution of Soviet civil defense into the late Soviet and post-Soviet or emergency management organizations that are basically all hazards. But it was a fraught process institutionally.
Okay.
Hi, it's Jeff Glick again. Two questions. One, didn't AmeriCom, the Soviet institution called AmeriCom, I think it's the name, they came to FEMA, I know, and they were dealing with natural disasters. They were a component of the military, but were they separate from the nuclear side? And the second question I have, I'll ask both now since I got the mic. The Soviet Union's offensive strategy, the published non-classified stuff, talked about winning the war, that
right.
They could win a nuclear war. And wouldn't that help then promote more civil defense? While on our side, we were essentially just the opposite. We were talking about the insanity, mad, and all the rest of it, mutual destruction. So that would sort of augur against having a lot of support. And if you could comment on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So can you give me an idea of exactly when these AmeriCom people were coming over? Because the answer kind of depends on the time frame.
Oh, really? It would be in the 90s, early 90s?
Right, yeah. So, it's actually unclear to me the extent to which because basically there was an order that I've seen, it was classified, and after Chernobyl, it basically said it's like, well, the nuclear civil defense planning should just be curtailed, even though for the time being, civil defense stayed in the Ministry of Defense. It seems like there was resistance to that, and some of the things I've seen from the end of the Soviet period are just plain contradictory. Some of them, it seems like the nuclear war planning mission has just disappeared. Other ones are not even talking about the natural disaster hazards, which I don't know what to make of that. And unfortunately, my documents give out around that time, so I can't really comment on that. The second question had to do with strategy, and basically in both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the civil defense organizations tried to harness whatever aspect of nuclear strategic theory they could that would justify their programs. So, and it was sometimes kind of absurd that they would be arguing completely antithetical things to different people at the same time. But in the Soviet case, what happened was that back in the 1960s, the Soviet nuclear strategic pronouncements actually do say, it's like there's a book called the Военная стратегия, literally military strategy, that just says, it's like, oh, like we're going to plan on winning the nuclear war. And it actually has a section there about how civil defense is going to help this. That doesn't make a terrible lot of sense in my view, what that chapter actually says. It's basically like, well, civil defense can help win the nuclear war by helping with mobilization before the war, which was apparently a very compelling argument to the people they needed to impress in the Soviet Union, because it got in the book and it seems to have gotten them more civil defense funding. But it's not anything like the sort of thing that the American strategic theorists like Herman Kahn are saying. It's like, oh, well, you can have, like, we can use these evacuations as a means of strategic leverage. That Herman Kahn actually used to trot this scenario out where it's like, okay, well, what happens to the U.S. is like we're in this tense sort of Cuban Missile Crisis sort of situation. The Soviets evacuate their cities. We don't have any civil defense plan. And so now the Soviets have shown all this fortitude and they're moving their population around. Like in a few days, they'll be able to say, it's like, okay, well, we can just like push the button and your population is vulnerable, so capitulate. And the Soviets, like I implied in the talk, they just thought that this was just like a ludicrous scenario. There doesn't seem to be any indication at all that they thought of civil defense as being strategically useful that way.
I'll take a question as well.
Sure.
Can you say a little bit more? You had this reference in your talk about using a German, and I didn't catch the name.
Erich Hampe.
Yes. To argue for an all-encompassing civil defense and shelter program. Can you say a little bit more about the international, and not just the Soviet and U.S. comparison, in terms of shelter construction, civil defense in general? Because it seems to me that there was also another player, the Swiss, who
right,
at that time started building, internationally recognized and standardized bunkers and stuff like that, that really impressed the Americans. I wonder
right.
how that played into that. And the other question I had is kind of going in the opposite direction. You worked with Ukrainian, in Ukrainian archives.
Mm-hmm.
How representative is, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic for Soviet, policy, and can you compare maybe other republics with the Ukrainian and the Russian Soviet republics?
Okay. So on the first question, specifically turning to the Swiss, it's like the Swiss are basically the only operators, with the possible exception of the Swedes, who had a civil defense organization that compared to the Soviets in technical sophistication, but because it was so much better funded on a per capita basis, it's probably better overall. The Soviets were monitoring, it's like they're monitoring our civil defense publications. They're also monitoring the Swedish and the Swiss and other West European civil defense publications. And they had this very large journal that was just translated articles from Western civil defense publications. So it turns out that they were basically reading all of our stuff. And when they learned something, they seemed to have used it, or they would take it out to their civil defense research institutes and they would try it out, and some sort of Sovietized variant of it would actually start appearing in the regulations. And it's also true that there was cooperation within the communist bloc on civil defense. So unfortunately, I never got as many documents about this as I wanted, but I saw references to how it's like, oh yeah, the Cuban civil defense people have come to Ukraine from Cuba to learn about civil defense. Like they were apparently taken around and shown things. And but it seemed there was a lot of variance. We know from unfortunately, there are not that many studies of civil defense in the non-Soviet communist countries, or mine's the first in the Soviet Union, so I suppose it's not that surprising. The one of East German civil defense was the only complete one that I know of, indicates that the East German program was actually very different from the Soviet one. Basically, the Soviets told them that they should be doing what the Soviets were doing, and then they sort of went off and occasionally did what the Soviets were doing, but a lot of the time kind of did their own thing, which doesn't really match our stereotype of communist governments as all marching in lockstep with Moscow. And so your second question had to do with, the individual Soviet republics. Okay, well, this is a tricky question because it's hard to know. There were 15, or at its height, 16 Soviet republics. They kind of have different personalities, right? And because I don't speak any of the non-Slavic languages, it's really hard for me to say, okay, well, it's like what things are like in Estonia or Tajikistan or somewhere like that. What I can say is from the documents that were being sent to the center that I did see in Moscow seemed to indicate that, implementation really varied a lot between the different Soviet republics. So apparently the Baltics and Estonia was a particular offender in this regard. People just would not implement the civil defense orders, like on training or otherwise. It's like the factory managers would just be like, I'm not doing that, and they didn't. Whereas implementation in Belarus and Russia seems to have been better, although Russia in particular is so big that it's like, okay, like whereas implementation in Moscow compared to implementation, you know, like in the Arctic somewhere, and it's like, well, it might as well be on a different planet. But I believe there's a lot of variation it's hard to get into, in part because how much can I trust the documents that are being sent to the center? And I was only seeing a non-representative sample of them anyway.
I'm Armin Musalim with the Red Cross. Three things. One is the East Germans and the West Germans did have an extensive shelter system. Matter of fact, it still exists in Berlin in particular. That took over the old facilities from the Second World War and to the point where they had both living facilities, medical facilities, et cetera, still there. Second thing is there were shelters identified in the United States under the Civil Defense Program, and they were stockpiled. Matter of fact, they had water and food and a whole variety of things, which became a big project in the 90s to take all that stuff out and get rid of it. But there were facilities identified, and a lot, I think, in the U.S. government, a lot of the civil defense, particularly under FEMA, was sort of in the black box category that wasn't very public, or that things were done and plans were set and crisis relocation for one and a number of other things. The third point is, in your research, that it come up that one of the precursors of engagement between the United States and the Soviet Union were proactive civil defense actions, i.e. starting to evacuate populations out of certain areas, et cetera. And that was an indication that things were getting real serious between had that showed up at all in any of your research either with the Soviet Union or the U.S.?
Specifically on the latter point, you mean? Well, basically, the notion of using civil defense for signaling purposes is something that I've never seen the Russians discuss. I mean, there are translations of some of these Western writings about civil defense that made this argument, but I've never seen the Soviets make an argument to the effect like this is something that we should do, in part because the planners who were in charge of planning these evacuations would comment, it's like, look, it's like when we initiate these evacuations, it's going to be total chaos. It's like we have all these plans to try and maintain social orders, like they're not going to work. It's like we know from back during the war when people were fleeing the Nazis, like this is not going to work. We can try, and we have to try and organize this so it's not as bad as it will be otherwise, but you will not be keeping people in the cities once the evacuation is ordered. And that's a real disincentive to the idea that, oh, well, we can use this for crisis signaling purposes.
Okay, there's a question from Dr. Toshihiro Higuchi from Georgetown University.
Okay.
You mentioned that in the Soviet Union, the civil defense program against the nuclear attack didn't really take off during the Stalin era. But was there an institutional carryover or any other kind of carryover from civil defense during World War II that might have served as a groundwork for the post-Stalin era civil defense?
Right. So institutionally, the Местная противовоздушная оборона, or MPVO, that organization is actually founded in 1932. It's just that they don't talk about nuclear weapons at all in public until 1954. And that seems to have been an ideological prescription, but the institution existed. It was part of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. There's a tremendous amount of continuity between before the war and during the war and after the war, because the Soviets thought that their experiences with civil defense in World War II had been successful. So the short answer is like, yes, there very much is. But there isn't any nuclear civil defense. So it's like they built shelters, they did gas mask drills, they did all of that, but there isn't there's no nuclear component at all under Stalin. That's it.
Any other questions, comments? Well, there's one more online question from Polly Liss. Is Israel's use of bomb shelters one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive for its population in the world?
You know, that's a good question. I just do not know enough about Israeli civil defense to comment on that. So I'm going to have to punt.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, please join me in thanking our speaker again. And there's a lot of food left outside, so please join us for some snacks.